Hey everyone, welcome to episode 20 of the What Comes to Mind series. And today we're actually talking about one of my roles, being a researcher. Yesterday I talked about the life of research and the various types that we have. But actually, what about the researchers themselves? How does one actually become a professor? That's what I want to talk about today. So when I was thinking about this topic, I know that around the world there are different versions, there are different systems on how a researcher, so a student becomes a researcher, how one does a PhD and becomes a professor. So what I thought to do is share the progression I hope to take in the next 5 to 10 years and show you where I'm at right now, what have I done, and what I hope to achieve in terms of becoming a professor. Now, with anything, if you want to become an expert and a leading figure in that field, you first need to know the fundamentals. And how does one do that? Is to undertake an undergraduate course or what we call a bachelor's course in a particular field. So in my case, I did biomedical science. So I learned like the basics around the body, the different systems, how things function, how do diseases occur, how does one treat them, how does one actually then test. So in the clinical lab, how does one actually test for something that's going to show that there's a disease potentially prevalent. So that was my undergraduate course, and that's kind of the foundation for this entire time frame and life cycle, doing an undergraduate course in a particular topic. So once you have thankfully finished and completed an undergraduate course, you would then go on to the next stage, which is generally a master's or masters, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And that's now looking at a specialized part of that area. So some people could do if I was to do a master's before my PhD, I would have done maybe advanced biomedical science or something in cancer genetics, epidemiology, or immunology, something a bit more specific that I spend a year or even 2 years focusing on and studying even in more depth. And when you're doing this particular part of the career path now, when you're doing a master's, you then start to appreciate the type of knowledge generated from research, because this kind of advanced, more specialized area is where you start to see, okay, this is actually the real benefit of doing research, because it's research that changes this type of knowledge. Earlier you learn the fundamentals, the bare basics of this very wide area. Then you start to become a bit more specialized. So the field is more narrow, but the in-depthness and the quantity and the quality becomes even more specialized. So now you're getting towards more refined, but becoming more of an expert in that area. So now towards the end of both of those pathways, so when you're doing an undergraduate course or when you're doing a master's course, towards the end you would do some form of a research project. And within the master's area, you would then start to look at a application of the knowledge you've just learned. So the advanced knowledge you've just learned, you would put it into a laboratory setting or a clinical setting, and you would then conduct a research project. And I like to call this a little bit of a taster for potential research career, i.e. potentially doing a PhD. So that's kind of then, you could say, the prerequisite to, do you decide, okay, do I enjoy this? Is this interesting? Okay, that's a good marker for if you are interested in doing something for 3 to 4 years. What is that thing? PhD. So now, PhD. A friend of mine used to call it, or used to say, PhD actually stands for permanent head damage. Because the amount of sheer torment you go through generally to get through a PhD is something only a person who goes through can really understand. And I could spend, again, a week talking about what I went through, what many other people went through when I was doing mine. And it is genuinely a huge life journey doing a PhD. Irrespective of whichever field you do, it is a tall order. And before I go into the PhD, something I used to always remind myself is, many people can start a PhD. Only a handful can actually finish. And only a few can actually finish and have the same desire, if not more, to do research. Because it really tests you. It rips you apart, and then if you can put yourself back together again, you can get through a PhD. So what is a PhD? Also known as a Doctorate of Philosophy. Yes, I can't do CPR or something like that, but when I did my PhD, you become a world expert in a very particular area. And the way it works is you have a research theme or topic. So for example, mine was looking at, okay, how can you stop cancer growth by cutting off the blood supply that supplies a cancer cell? If you can starve it of oxygen and nutrients, can you theoretically stop the cancer growing? So that was my subject area, And then I looked at a very particular part of that for 3 to 4 years. And the difference to the other degrees is this is now a full-on research degree. You're not taught, you don't go to lectures, you don't go to exams, you don't submit assignments. It is now you working on experimenting, whether you look at patients, whether you conduct interviews, whether you do field research, or whether you what I did, which is conducting research in a laboratory to identify results that may link to my question. So, to break it down a bit more, I had to learn how to do some experiments, some very specialized experiments that will help me to gather some new information, that will help me to prove or disprove a hypothesis I actually had. So I could say in my PhD, this particular compound found in a natural product would cause a stoppage of blood vessel formation in this particular model. So I will spend 2 to 3 and obviously 4 years conducting experiments to prove or disprove that theory in many different fronts. So as I mentioned earlier, I would learn the experiments, conduct my experiments myself, start to understand some new information, take that information and then run with it. So if I got this type A information, right, what does that tell me? What new experiment can I do? Also, what new research can I do to further understand? Because you have to remember, during a PhD, you are creating or understanding new knowledge and you're trying to prove it or disprove it. And that's why it takes so long, because you spend so long confirming whatever you found, is it true? Okay, so if I said that this compound, for instance, did something, how can I prove it 5 different ways? If I put it in this type of experiment, do we get the same result? If I do it in this type of experiment, do we get the same result? And to generalize it more, so it's not just focused on laboratory science, if somebody is doing qualitative work, so they're looking at a person's emotions or perceptions or feelings, they will see, okay, we predict that the large consensus of this particular population feel very strongly towards this type of subject, or they have this strong emotion towards this stimuli. And a person will conduct interviews, will conduct experiments with people to say, okay, if I also asked you these questions, how would you feel? And then through their actual answers, so their data is the person's answers, whereas my data was looking at a bunch of ones and zeros, so looking at a number, the number was high or low, that will give me some sort of information. And that's essentially, in a crux, what a PhD is all about. Experimenting for 3-4 years on a topic that's very specialized. Because I really want to spend a bit of time on this part of the journey, because it's one of the most pivotal. As if you look at it from a student's career, it is probably the highest qualification you can achieve. Undergraduate, master's, and then a PhD. But in the research world, it's actually the foundation of your research career. And I used to look at it when I was towards the end of my PhD to say, okay, this qualification allows me to sit on the table of researchers. It kind of qualifies me to say to people, right, I can research independently, so I can be given a topic, I can think of the type of experiments needed, I can run those experiments, so have the capabilities of running those experiments, whether it's conducting interviews or doing laboratory work, and I can come to some reasonable conclusions about what this may or may not tell me. So to really help understand this, because many, and I still get this question now, is what do you do in a PhD? I've already mentioned some parts of it, but I want to try and help many more people understand what actually happens. I didn't do exams. I didn't have to go to a teacher and say, okay, what's the next assignment? You basically are given a title, a project, and you need to go away for a certain amount of years figuring out, what does this mean? How can I develop new information? That's essentially what a PhD is. So for those who are in the business world, who are obviously not in the research world, imagine your manager coming to you and saying, right, we're looking at this completely new area. I want you to figure out whether this is useful or not. That sounds very basic, of course. But you need to produce an entire report that takes years, figuring out all these different trial and errors that you did to form a definitive conclusion that, okay, you've asked me to do this. This is what I was able to find. Research. You do research for that many years. So I want to help people differentiate that it is not a advanced degree, like a taught degree, where you get taught by lecturers, you do coursework, you do some formal exam, and then once you finish those exams, you passed. A PhD is completely different to that. And that's why many people who might not know that difference, they really struggle, because they don't understand the difference between a taught degree and a research degree. And to finish on this part, to give you an idea of what comes out of a PhD, it is, have you identified something novel in that field? So with mine it was, I identified that this particular compound that I made in the lab, it was showing some very interesting properties against a cell that makes up a blood vessel. That's simply what I was able to find. So through my experimentation, I developed some new form of knowledge that contributed to the field. Second, is the new knowledge that you've got really beneficial? Because I can look at, okay, how to make a new form of a dustbin potentially. Are you really significantly benefiting that field? You know, are you reinventing the wheel per se? So that notion of the new knowledge that you found, is it actually beneficial? So then you're probably wondering, okay, how do you pass a PhD? With other courses, because they were taught, you do some exams or some coursework and you pass. How do you pass a PhD? How do you complete a PhD? When I did all of those painstaking work for 6-7 days a week for nearly 4 years, you write a big thesis, so you can say a massive dissertation or a really, really comprehensive report is another way to look at it. I then had a world expert from a different university and a leading expert in the university who would sit in front of me like an interrogation and would look at what I've written and would grill me for hours. Why did you do this? What was the point of this? How did you do this? What was the point of this? What do you think this is? What do you think that is? I was grilled for 4 hours in my PhD. And if they feel that, one, they believe that I've done the work, two, they're satisfied with the results that I achieved and then concluded, they feel like this is novel, it is beneficial, and then you are awarded a PhD subject to corrections of your thesis. But I want to go into that particular process because for me it was very iconic in my life and how I approached that last hurdle. So to give you an idea, this is called a viva, so an oral examination. This is this last hurdle that I'm talking about. And after all the pain that I went through, more than the average person, I would say, and I realized that I am not stopping at this hurdle. I'm not going to lose this chance at this hurdle. So I didn't go on the defensive there, like, oh no, what happens? I actually went on the offensive. I said, this is now a boxing match. For 4 hours, it's me versus you. Whoever wins, wins. I'm not going to leave anything inside. I'm going to leave everything on the table. You're here to prove or to disprove that, do you know your stuff? I know better than you. I'm here to prove to you that I know that book that you're reading inside out. I know exactly why I did things, I know why I did things, and I know what I concluded and what the overall results were. And I looked at it as a boxing match. And in my thesis, which is in the description box by the way, if you do want to read it or if you've got questions about the type of research I did, I looked at it as, this is a 4-year boxing match, and for 4 years I've not been able to do anything. I've just been gathering results, taking in all the pain and all the hurdles. This is now my chance to fight back. I looked at it as a fight. My viva, my PhD viva was a fight. I looked at it and said, okay, this is my chance now to punch. I want to make sure it counts. And then thankfully I was able to succeed and get awarded a PhD. But that's the mindset I actually had. That's the attacking process I actually had. So then I mentioned earlier about, okay, in the research terms, this is the foundation of your research career. This allows you to get into that field of doing research as a profession. So what happens after a PhD? What do you actually do? This phase is known as postdoctoral research, or short postdoc. So this is now you have the qualification to prove to people you can research independently, you can kind of do research on your own if you just were given a task or a project. And this is when you start to do research as a job, as an actual profession. And many people finish their PhD and they go into a postdoc, so a research focused position, generally around about 2 to 3 years, because generally what happens is a professor has applied for a grant to do some research and they employ a postdoc to carry out that research. They employ PhD students to do research to train them, but a postdoc you can say is generally already trained. They have acquired the skills in their PhD generally. They know how to write a research paper, they know how to conduct research generally. They have supervised maybe some undergraduate students or master students whilst they're doing their PhD unofficially. And then when you go to a postdoc level, you're doing more research on your own, of course. You're doing it generally with a team perhaps, but you're also sharing your experiences to the current PhD students at the moment. You're then looking after the research for the professor generally. So the professor or the associate professor goes off to get on with some potential teaching or to apply for more grants. And it's the postdoc who then is kind of like the operations manager of that research group then. They're the ones who then kind of look after the research, make sure it's continuing, gathering new findings, and report back to the professor. So they're kind of the overseer. They do a lot of research, of course, still. They're not up to that professor level yet, but they're kind of like the professor's research assistant, you know. Even though the term research assistant for something else, a postdoc is generally that kind of category. And that's the stage I am at. So I'm a postdoc at the moment in respiratory medicine, focused on looking at new ways to counteract problems that happen when people take steroids when they are severe asthmatics. So it's here when you start to publish more research into journals, you start to build up your profile as a researcher. So the techniques you've mastered, the people you've worked for, the research you've published. And then once you're doing this, you're kind of refining your craft. You've learned your craft in your PhD, you're now refining and improving your expertise in the particular area that you want to focus on. Because many postdocs in my situation, most of their goals, not all the time, but many of them are now looking to get into academia to establish themselves. So what's that process there? How does a person go from a temporary 3-year contract as a researcher, as a postdoc, to getting a full-time permanent position in academia where they can teach and do some actual research of their own? This is what we call a lecturer. A person who's generally done a PhD, has some postdoc experience, and is now want to establish themselves at a university where they can conduct their own research now as what we call a principal investigator. So they now have designed an idea themselves, they've applied for some money, and they want to employ students or research assistants to carry out that work. Their trade is they do some teaching, depending on the university that you're at, you do some form of teaching, and then the rest of the time is allocated to do some form of research. And that's when a lecturer, so some people all call the early career research fellow, kind of like a research lecturer, and some people also term the word lecturer. And that's the next phase. After a postdoc, that's generally the next phase for many people. Some go into industry where they work for actual companies, but in terms of talking about my progression, what I want to do, my next phase is to acquire a full-time lectureship where I can focus on research and do some teaching on a particular module. So once you've been teaching on a module of a course, you've had some undergraduate students under your belt, you've supervised them, you may even start to have a PhD student of your own to conduct the research that you now have designed. You've got all the expertise, you've published research, you've got your PhD a while ago, generally on principle, and you're now establishing your own research. You're generally your own research as a PI, as I mentioned, as a principal investigator. So then the next stage is actually to become a senior lecturer, a senior academic, where you may have completed a PhD student, so you may have supervised a student to completion. You potentially may be a module leader, so let's say you've got a course, an undergraduate course, and maybe 7 or 8 modules, and you're the leader of one module. Some people are even the leader of the actual program itself. You've published quite a lot of research in you can say 4 or 5 years you've been an academic, as a rough guideline. So you're now becoming a very senior part of that team. So in that school of research that you do, you're quite a key figurehead, and that's you now becoming more experienced as both a lecturer and a PI, so a principal investigator. So to recap so far, you've done an undergraduate for 3 years, then you've done a master's for 1 year, that's 4 years. You've then done a PhD for 4 years, generally on principle, so that's now 8 years. You then potentially have done a postdoc or 2, so let's say you've done 1 postdoc, so that's 3 years. So you're now looking at, if I can count, 11 years before you become a lecturer, and then maybe you're a lecturer for about 3 years, and then you get promoted to a senior lecturer. So you're looking at close to around 15 years until from start to finish. So once you finish your A-levels or high school in the US, and then you're now looking at the professorial level, which is one of my dreams, I hope. Not hope, I'm going to get there, definitely. So generally in the UK, once you have been a senior academic for a while, you can get promoted to an associate professor. So level in between a lecturer and the actual professor. So here, generally people have had many PhD students. They're quite a senior part of the actual research around the world. So when you Google immunology or severe asthmatics and corticosteroids, you'll come across a term or some people related to that field. So you're quite a key figure generally in that area. you have taught on the course for several years, you've been a program leader, you've done extracurricular activities as well. So, you know, you've been an admission tutor for the course, you've helped in some ethics committees, all these extra things outside of academia. Generally for a few years you become this associate professor. So you're a key part of one of the main research groups at your university. As I mentioned, you've had master students, undergraduates, PhDs. You even start to employ research assistants because you're now at that senior level where you can apply for bigger grants to fund your research, and you're now a much bigger figure at that university for obvious reasons. Then we get to the notion of the professor. One of my ultimate goals in the end is to become a professor in an area. For me, it would most likely be nutrition and immunology, but that can change as I develop my career. Now, professor is one of those, I term them a leader. The reason why is their main focus in their role is to look after the people who do the work. They have their postdocs, their research assistants, who are PhD students, master students, undergrad. They're looking after the entire team of sometimes, 10 to 12 individuals who are doing the research they have now developed and pioneered perhaps. So they don't do the work in the lab. They don't, look at the nitty-gritty things where they have to apply for, consumables to do some research in the lab, or they're recruiting participants for some qualitative work. No. Their work for them is to look after the people who do the work. They will apply for funding to keep the research growing, but it's the postdocs who look after the research. It's the PhD students who develop the research. It's the master students and undergraduates who supplement the work. A professor now is a person who's done all of the hard graft for many years, who now look after the people who do the work. And I don't want to spend too much time on this one because I just want you to imagine, it's one of those key leaders. A professor is one who's experienced. They probably talk less and facilitate more. And some people call me a professor because of how I am, and I take it as a compliment because I want to be that type of person. That's one of my goals in life, is to be a professor. Not just because of the title, but to be able to have that role where I can do the research I've always wanted to do with a team that I've always wanted to have. Let me know in the comment section below before I move on about, would you love for me to interview professors and share their life about how did they go about their journey that I have just talked about? I personally would love that, but if you want love for me to record that and share it on YouTube, let me know and I will work on trying to produce just that. So that's a little snapshot of the research career I have done so far and I intend on doing. And let me know your thoughts, because keeping with the series about what comes to mind. When I think of researcher, this is exactly what comes to mind. This whole journey is what comes to mind. What did I do in my undergrad? My entire journey in my PhD. What I aim to see as a postdoc. What type of lecturer I want to be. Which university I want to go to be a lecturer. This is what comes to mind when I think of the word researcher. The question is, what comes to mind when you think of it? So that concludes the end of today's video. I know it's slightly different in terms of topic, but I hope you benefited just to get an insight into a field or type of work you probably wouldn't know about, in terms of what is a PhD, how to do a PhD, how does one actually become a professor. So I hope this information was useful, and I genuinely hope you can follow me in my journey to becoming one day a professor. I hope that this channel grows, the videos that I do grow, and people learn and benefit, and hopefully go along with me as I hopefully progress. And let me know your thoughts about the series so far in the comments, and what do you think of a researcher? Because I firmly believe we are all researchers in different, we don't have to put a professional label on it. Some of you may be researchers in something outside as a hobby, so let me know your thoughts on the word researcher. I shall see you tomorrow for episode 21. Pretty incredible, right? See you soon.